Hey there, students. I'm getting a lot of questions about post-World War II stuff, okay, because this is kind of problematic because if your teacher's in the same boat that I'm in and my students are in, we're not really getting to the post-World War II stuff. A lot of times I do this in a review session the week before the exam or something like that. And a lot of people are panicking, especially with Snowpocalypse and Snowpocalypse 2 and all of that kind of stuff. So I'll put this in the comments. I'm going to go ahead and go over the key content, just stuff that I've looked back and I've seen stuff about this, and to help you tackle the multiple choice questions, especially when it comes to this post-World War II content. So first of all, let's talk the Cold War, all right? First of all, there is the Marshall Plan.
Students. I'm getting a lot of questions
Whoa,
about
what's going on?
post-World War II stuff, okay, because this is kind of problematic because if your teacher's in the same boat
Okay,
that
I was watching my own Hangout, okay, so I don't know if anybody's watching live, but I pulled that up, and sorry, that was a little bit of a difficulty. So let's try this again. I'm still learning the ropes of this. All right, so the Cold War, first of all, you need to understand the Marshall Plan, which was an effort by the United States to keep Western Europe from becoming communist. This is part of the overall policy of containment of communism, that communism is not supposed to spread beyond where it already is. And so the United States sends a whole bunch of money in the form of what is officially called the European Recovery Plan, but it's named for U.S. Secretary of State Marshall. And so keep that in mind, that the United States is going to get more and more involved as a leader in the fight against communism, and it's going to form closer ties with Western Europe than it had previously. And the United States and Western Europe form NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a collective defense pact. All of the nations in NATO agree to come to each other's aid if one of the nations is attacked. An attack on one of us is an attack on us all. And then there is the Warsaw Pact, which is an alliance of the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union, which is also a collective defense pact. So in this case, remember World War I, the alliance system didn't work that well. Well, after World War II, the alliance system actually works, partly because everybody knows who's allied with who. It's a pretty uncomplicated situation. It's like, look, one group's allied here, one group's allied here. Don't attack anybody if you don't want to start World War III. Pretty easy to understand. All right, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 kind of starts this process of the collapse of communism, which happens in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. Also, as far as the Cold War, you might want to note that Yugoslavia was led by a guy named Tito, who was not aligned with the Soviets, and so therefore he even got a little bit of Marshall Plan money. So Yugoslavia was an independent communist state. Now, while we're talking about the Cold War, let's go ahead and talk about Soviet leaders. Okay, there are three major Soviet leaders that you need to just have a little bit of familiarity with if you're going to tackle one of those questions on the exam. There's Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and Gorbachev. All right, so Khrushchev takes over in the late 50s and is there into the 60s. He's the guy that's there during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, he follows Stalin, and one of his first acts in office as the General Secretary of the Communist Party is to denounce Stalin's cult of personality. He says that he's not going to be that kind of dictatorial figure, that sort of thing. You've got an end to the worst of the gulags and all of that. And Khrushchev tries to lessen the tension a little bit by talking about peaceful coexistence with the capitalist world, that it is possible for everyone to exist together and not constantly be on a war footing. Now, of course, this is the same guy that went in front of the UN and banged his shoe on the podium and said to the West, "We will bury you." Now, of course, if we just hear that out of context, "we will bury you," we think of, well, that's really threatening rhetoric, but really he meant economically. He meant that socialism is superior to capitalism as an economic system. Then there's Brezhnev, who is the premier during most of the 1970s, even into the early 80s, and during his time, there are two things. First of all, you need to understand that there's general economic malaise and stagnation during the 70s. Nobody's economy is really great during that time, including the United States. Excuse me. And Then you need to know about the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine is a doctrine that says these Eastern Bloc countries that Stalin wanted as a sphere of influence that are supposed to be under the thumb of the Soviet Union, well, some of those countries in the 60s and 70s were starting to try to liberalize and adopt forms of a free market economy and free elections and try to break free of Soviet influence. Brezhnev says no, he's going to put down rebellions if they happen. So that's that. Now, then there's Gorbachev, who is most famous for his reforms, Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost meaning openness, and Perestroika about restructuring. Now, Glasnost, I always remember that because I think Glasnost, because like glass, you can look into it and see through it and that sort of thing. Glasnost, openness. So the Soviet Union is going to have a new level of openness. There's going to be restructuring. Keep in mind that Gorbachev is not trying to dismantle communism. Now, that's what happens, but he thought that the only way to save communism was to restructure it by making it more open. But once it was open, people didn't really want it. Communism and freedom, like, people don't really choose communism. Communism's typically forced upon people. Another thing about Gorbachev is he renounced the Brezhnev Doctrine when in the late 80s there were Eastern European, Soviet bloc countries that were trying to break free. He didn't do anything about that, and that culminates with the Berlin Wall coming down in 1989, and it's obvious that the Soviets are not going to do anything about it, and eventually you've got the collapse of communism from 1991. Now, while we in America like to think that we kind of forced that, you know, basically on the exam, you've got to think about in terms of communism collapsing from within, okay, even though sometimes, you know, we do like to take the credit. In 1968, there were a whole bunch of student protests, really just all across Europe. That happened in the United States as well. So just keep in mind, 1968 was a big year, young people demonstrating and throwing stuff at each other or whatever, all right? Immigration and basically problems with assimilation of people coming in from North Africa, guest workers notably. Europeans were allowing people to come in on guest worker visas, and these people came in and they were kind of forming enclaves. They weren't really learning the language, that sort of thing. There was a guy named Enoch Powell in England who was a member of the Conservative Party, gave a speech called Rivers of Blood. This comes from Virgil's Aeneid, and he quoted a passage where it says, "I see wars, endless wars. I see the Tiber foaming with blood." And Powell and the people that followed him, they were very concerned about excessive immigration and that the British were losing their identity. Now, keep in mind also that sort of rhetoric was viewed by people who didn't agree with him as racist and nativist and all of that kind of stuff. So depending on where somebody stands, but immigration is still a big issue in Britain. It comes up every time there's an election, as far as not just immigration from other parts of the world, but also immigration from Eastern Europe. I'm going to talk about the European Union in a bit. Let's go ahead and talk about feminism. All right, now, you know, like I said, I'd like to do some more formal videos on this stuff later, but I'm just giving you a brief overview. Now, one work that you need to be familiar with is Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, in which she writes about women as a second sex, which really, before the 1960s, typically he is the common person, okay, and a woman, Beauvoir says, is viewed as other, that a male is seen as the default human being and that a woman is seen as something else, and she sees a problem with this, and this is typical of second wave feminism. Now keep in mind, first wave feminism in the early 20th century, late 19th century, they were concerned about political equality. They were concerned about the vote, And after World War II, you start to see women who have been working in armaments factories and that sort of thing. They want not just political equality, which they've had for a while, but they want social and economic equality. They want equal pay for equal work. That's something that women aren't talking about before World War II. They want to get over the glass ceiling. They want access to birth control and legal abortions, which these are things that don't really enter the scene until after World War II. Equal pay, birth control, and that sort of thing. And while we're talking about birth control, let's go ahead and talk about the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church has never given the nod to abortion, birth control, ordination of female priests. So keep in mind that anything that is going to suggest that the Catholic Church has evolved socially, that they've gotten a more modern outlook, that's going to be false, because the Catholic Church has stood by its socially conservative teachings when it comes to the family, when it comes to women, when it comes to birth control and abortion. Another thing about the Catholic Church is its stance on economics. Now, in the late 19th century, questions tend to focus on the disconnect between regular workers and the Catholic Church kind of siding against unions and the working class. In the late 20th century, the Catholic Church, especially under the leadership of John Paul II from Poland, was anti-communist. Now, keep in mind that just because the Catholic Church is anti-communist doesn't mean that it's pro-capitalist. Oftentimes, popes have made statements against the excesses of capitalism and the unfair distribution of wealth and so on and so forth. But keep in mind that the Catholic Church did oppose communism, which of course also opposed religion and that sort of thing. But the Catholic Church in the late 20th century and even the early 21st century doesn't necessarily embrace free market liberal capitalism. Margaret Thatcher, she's come up a good bit. So know that Margaret Thatcher was the first elected head of state. She was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during the late 70s and throughout the 80s. So she's, I believe, the longest serving Prime Minister in modern history, perhaps ever, but she was there for over a decade as the head of government. Now, she's, like I said, the first woman elected head of state. There have been some since then. Of course, there have been monarchs before her, but never elected. Now, Thatcherism is socially conservative, economically liberal. Now, keep in mind, liberal in the European sense, that industries that had been run by the government, she's wanting to privatize. Another thing that seems to come up a lot is Thatcher's relationship with the labor unions. There had been the winter of discontent that led to her election as prime minister, and this winter of discontent, there were a lot of public sector unions that were going on strike, and what happened is essentially the unions had pushed too far, and the people of Britain had decided that they'd had enough, so they bring in Thatcher, who was tough on the unions and was able to beat them back a good bit. So just keep that in mind about Thatcherism. Also very much into the Cold War, a partner with Ronald Reagan, and all of that stuff. The final topic I'm going to address is the topic of European integration, the process of Europe uniting politically and economically. Now, of course, we see that process starting to unravel right now, but that's probably not really going to come up on the exam, because the exam doesn't cover to 2014. It covers to 2001-ish. So European integration began with the European Economic Community, which was established by the Treaty of Rome. You also had the European Coal and Steel Community, something like that. Let's see, let me look that up real quick, make sure I'm not telling you something false. Yes, the European Coal and Steel Community. So these are during like the late 60s, early 70s, that sort of thing, that these are efforts to integrate Europe economically. So the coal and steel and the economic community integrating economically, trying to promote free trade and that sort of thing. Now, after the fall of communism, about the same time as that, you've got the Maastricht Treaty, which established the European Union. And the European Union brought Europe into a firmer economic integration, introducing the euro, which is a common currency, which about every member of the EU except for Britain uses, or the UK rather, whatever you want to call it. Keep in mind Britain, the UK, England, all that's interchangeable. So the Maastricht Treaty brings about the EU and the euro, and more recently you've got the European Parliament. Now the European Parliament only has certain very limited powers, but you do have a sense of political integration that's happened in Europe, that Europe has become more united both economically and politically. Now, with that has come Euroscepticism. Euroscepticism is an undercurrent in Europe that is against European integration, believes that it has gone too far. And Euroscepticism is especially strong in Britain. Okay, now Margaret Thatcher, she's known for her no, no, no speech. If you type it on YouTube, Margaret Thatcher, no, no, no. You'll see her responding, and she's going off about the European Union and the ideas of that, and she was very much against that. Now, of course, you see that the UK still has the pound. They don't use euros as a unit of currency. Some of my students that just went to Europe said that you can pay for something with euros, but they'll give you your change back in pounds. They don't want the common currency. So there's always been kind of a love-hate relationship. The European Parliament elections are actually coming up in a few weeks. It'd make a great little post-exam project. I'll probably do something with my class. They'll probably hate it. But anyway, those elections are coming up, and the UK actually has a party called the UK Independence Party. And what they favor, their one platform issue, is to get out of the European Union. And part of that is the stuff I've gone into earlier as far as immigration from other parts of Europe. Members of the European Union have to allow immigration from all parts of the European Union and free movement. Well, in some of the wealthier countries like Britain, they're absorbing a lot of immigration from Poland and Eastern Europe. So that's a big issue. There are a lot of people in the UK who would like to get out of the European Union entirely. What you're going to see there is, the Conservative Party has a Eurosceptic element within it as well. So, you run the whole gamut with people who would like even more European integration, people who believe that it's gone far enough, and then people who believe that it's gone too far or want to get rid of it entirely. I'm going to put this little outline that I've come up with here in the about section. Just look down and you'll see all of the stuff that I've touched on. So if you want to read up a little more on this stuff, you're welcome to take a look at that. But I think I've given you a nice little survey to give you at least a at least a basis for further inquiry to make sure that you're able to do as well as possible in the AP Euro exam, even though your teacher, like me, may not have been able to spend a whole lot of time on that post-World War II stuff. So I'll have some more Hangouts coming up, so look around this weekend and early next week, maybe even the morning of the exam. So stay tuned. I'm on Twitter, @TomRichey. I'll be posting some announcements there, so find me Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Pretty easy to find on all those places. So I'll be back. Hopefully so will you. Good luck on the exam. Until next time. Whoa, gosh, the cough's got too many. I need to drink some tea or something. Looks like I've got 6 viewers. I don't know if I'm able to take questions, but I'm going to figure that out. If you're watching right now, thank you. I'll be back. 7 viewers now. Whoa.